building software today is much faster than it was just a few years ago. The tools are higher level, and they abstract away tasks that would have required months of development in the past. Much of a developer's time used to be spent optimizing databases, load balancers, and queuing systems in order to be able to handle the load created by just thousands of users. Today, scalability is built into much of our infrastructure pieces by default. We've had several years of infrastructure with automatic scalability, and some of the more recent advances in developer tooling are about convenience and faster development time. These are tools that are built because we're no longer worrying so much about automatic scalability, since that's built into the tools. Developers are spending less and less time with the ambiguous idea of a server and the problems of distributed systems that come out of those servers, and more time interacting with well-defined APIs and data sources. And developers have a lot of trust in the consistency and the reliability of the distributed systems applications that they can focus more on the higher level components of their application and their own unique application data model. A few examples of this higher level data source system are AppSync from Amazon Web Services and Firebase from Google. These tools are like databases with very rich interactive functionality. And if you have done any high-level application prototyping recently, or built any new apps yourself, or built web apps, mobile apps, things that you're entirely building from scratch in the last couple of years, and you haven't looked at Firebase or AppSync, these things might be very useful to you because they take so much of the difficulty out of application development, at least on the back end. So instead of having to create a server to listen to a database for changes and push notifications to your users in response to those changes, AppSync and Firebase are back-end systems that can be programmed to have this kind of functionality built in. And it can be kind of hard to explain what that means unless you've actually dealt with it or if you have tried to build a back-end service. But you really get a lot of value out of having these high-level, rich, database-like systems with server capacity, server functionality built in. Things like push notifications in response to a database update. That used to be something that you would have to build an entire service to be listening to your database for, and now it's available in these super rich database-like products like AppSync or Firebase. And there are many other examples of high-level APIs, rich backends, developer productivity tools that lead to shorter development time. It's much faster to build applications today, consumer applications, business applications, and this gives you a lot of leverage as an engineer. And how should you respond to that leverage? It means that you can have faster expectations for getting a product to market. We can prototype really quickly for low amounts of money without sacrificing quality. We can also keep our teams smaller. We can perhaps raise less money. We can spend more time focusing on design and user experience and business models, and less time focusing on keeping the application up and running. Today I talked to Nader Dabit, who is a developer advocate at Amazon Web Services. And I always enjoy talking to Nader because he's entrepreneurial, but he is now working in Amazon. And there's a lot of conversation that we have in this episode about why would somebody as entrepreneurial as Nader, he did run a very successful business where he trained people how to use React Native. He has a podcast, React Native, I think it's, React Native Radio. He has written books. He's done a lot of stuff on his own, and yet he still decided to go and join Amazon. He joined Amazon Web Services as a developer advocate, where he works on developer tooling, developer outreach, and he explains why he did that, why he left working by himself to go work for Amazon. It makes complete sense to me. But we also talk about, more generally, how developer tooling is changing and how that change in tooling changes the potential for high output, fast iteration among developers. It's a strategic, philosophical discussion of how to build modern software, how to build businesses, and how to position yourself when there's so much change going on and there's so much tooling that you could take advantage of. We also talk a little bit about AR and some of the potential applications there, other platforms that are nascent. And I really enjoyed this conversation because it is the same kind of stuff that I'm always thinking about. What can I build? How fast can I build it? Is there a durable business opportunity in something? And we touch on all these things. Before we get on with the show, I want to mention that I am hiring for a new company that I'm starting, and I can't talk about the product quite yet. Just give me a month or two. But I'm very excited about it, and I'm looking for an engineer in the Bay Area with significant experience in React.js and some sort of cloud, whether that's Heroku or Firebase or Google Cloud or AWS, just a backend cloud technology. And if you have that experience and you think you would work well with me, email me at jeff@softwareengineeringdaily.com, or you can check out the job posting for more details at softwareengineeringdaily.com/jobs. Failure is unpredictable. You don't know when your system will break, but you know it will happen. Gremlin prepares for these outages. Gremlin provides resilience as a service using chaos engineering techniques pioneered at Netflix and Amazon. Prepare your team for disaster by proactively testing failure scenarios. Max out CPU, black hole, or slow down network traffic to a dependency. Terminate processes and hosts. Each of these shows how your system reacts, allowing you to harden things before a production incident. Check out Gremlin and get a free demo by going to gremlin.com/sedaily. That's gremlin.com/sedaily to get your free demo of how Gremlin can help you prepare with resilience as a service. Nader Dabit, you are a developer advocate at AWS. Welcome back to Software Engineering Daily.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So last time you were on, we talked about React Native, and today we're talking about something that's quite different. We might talk about React some, but there's a stark difference in how to build a consumer-facing application today versus 5 to 10 years ago. And that's really the thing that you and I wanted to talk about on the podcast today. Basically, the idea is that I don't think people realize just how much faster software development has gotten. And I think you would probably agree with this. That's why I'm excited to talk to you. And so I want to start this conversation by just going through some examples of consumer applications that people think of as quite hard to build, but there's actually a lot of newer tools that make these applications much easier to build. So there's a set of applications I think even a boot camp graduate or a computer science university student could hack together in a few weekends with modern tools that if we were talking about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, these things would be much, much harder to build. And so to go through some examples, I want to start with Instagram, because this is obviously an app that tons of people use. So if you were to build Instagram today, how would you contrast that with how you would build it 5 years ago?
Well, I guess to start with, you could kind of think about the team that would be involved in building it, or you could just say the person involved in building it. If we're kind of talking about how you might throw something together today and, like you said, a few weekends, at least get like a prototype or something like that. Before you would have to have a full team of engineers. Probably you'd need a DevOps team or a DevOps person. Maybe you'd need someone that was understood server-side development really well. You need a front-end developer. You might even need mobile developers for the different platforms that you're on, so iOS and Android. I guess maybe a system administrator. You're talking about a good 5 to 10 people. And that's kind of just, unless, of course, the person understood all of this stuff, which I guess is possible. But in reality, it's kind of rare for someone to be specialized in all these different areas. But, today, what we're going to be talking about is taking advantage of managed services and how you can kind of use an authentication provider like Auth0 or AWS. We have our Cognito or whatever authentication provider you'd like to use. You can use a managed database layer like either what we have is AWS AppSync or Firebase or something like that to kind of manage your data store. That kind of would get you to the point where you could maybe leave off the server side developer and be the front end developer working with these services. And then S3 to store your images or whatever media that you're working with. I guess with Instagram, it would be images and videos. But the idea is taking advantage of managed services as a front end developer, increasing your productivity and moving further up the stack. And I think that's kind of a general thing that we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the coming years. And we at AWS Mobile, where I work, we're building a lot of stuff around it. But I think a lot of other cloud providers are looking into this space and they're building a lot of tooling around it because I think it's kind of going to be the future of where you're going to be seeing a lot of software engineering in the future. So
completely agree. So, 5 or 10 years ago, I would probably start with a Rails monolith or perhaps a Node.js monolith. I would be running my own Mongo database. I would have to set up my own database node. And today, both the server aspect of software development and the database aspect have been rapidly, the process of building them has been rapidly accelerated. The process of maintaining them, the DevOps role that you might have needed to hire for in the past is kind of abstracted into the position of the cloud provider. So I think that will be one theme of the conversation today. So what are the specific tools that are making this faster? That are making the development process faster? So we're talking about like abstracting away our backend, like replacing the Rails monolith of the past or the Node monolith of the past, or replacing the self-hosted Mongo database of the past. What are the tools that are replacing those tools?
So specifically on the database end, what we're going to be seeing in the future, we're going to see other companies, I think, come out with stuff like this. But at AWS, we have an abstraction or a managed GraphQL service called AWS AppSync. And GraphQL, you've probably heard about it. If you haven't, it's basically a different way of interacting with your resources than the traditional REST API. And the general idea behind it is you have more control over your payload size. You ask for what you need from the back end, from your database, and you get only that. So you end up with smaller payloads. You also end up with just a completely different general idea of how you build out. It's a different philosophy of how you build out your APIs. But to go into what AppSync is, it's basically a managed GraphQL service. So with AppSync, you can have a single GraphQL endpoint, and you can then work with pretty much any data source, Lambda function that you would like. So you end up having more of like a consistent API working with multiple different resources. So if you have, for instance, a DynamoDB table or a DynamoDB database, you also have maybe Elasticsearch for searching. Maybe you have different Lambda functions working with microservices that have nothing to do with AWS. You can basically interact with all of these different resources using a consistent and single API endpoint. So before you would have to have maybe just, this is kind of more like a GraphQL thing. Say you would have a user's resource in your REST API, and then you would have maybe users slash, another endpoint like students maybe, or maybe you would have users slash students slash semester one or whatever. You would have all of these different endpoints kind of to drill down and get different types of information. With GraphQL, you would basically have your users as the main resource, and then you could then ask for the different data from within those users. So you could, instead of having multiple endpoints, you're basically working with a single endpoint and having different asks, I guess you'd say, from your database.
So GraphQL, the challenge that I always used to hear about GraphQL was that you have to set up your own server. You have to set up a GraphQL server because GraphQL is this piece of middleware that translates all of your GraphQL specific requests into into specific requests for your different backends. So like if you had Elasticsearch backend, if you had a Node backend, if you had some other kind of backend, a Lambda function, it would be able to federate the requests to those different backends, and that setting up that middleware layer of the GraphQL server is kind of annoying. How has that been simplified?
So I think you hit the nail on the head with that. And that's kind of where a new technology like GraphQL, that's just kind of what's going to happen at first. There's going to be a lot of innovation, a lot of changes, and no real consistency across any best practices or different tooling around it. I think we've seen a lot of work done lately, especially with Apollo. They've released a new Apollo server that seems to work really well. But really, at the end of the day, building a GraphQL server on top of your existing resource, maybe if you have an existing REST API or if you just have an existing database, it is a lot of work. And dealing with best practices around something this new, and then thinking about things like security and authentication and authorization, and and also just building it to be as fast as possible, it's not an easy task. And you have to think about not only learning how GraphQL works, but then you're also implementing the typical things that you would in your database fetching operations. So I think where something like AppSync or something like AppSync in the future, I'm sure there's going to be other things out there. What you're gaining there is you're having a competent group of engineers that have spent a lot of time thinking out these best practices and building them for you. So instead of having to learn all this stuff and understand all of it, you basically can just use a managed service where people have already done all this work, and you can just depend on your managed service and the decisions made there. And you can just build your front end and not really have to worry about building, maintaining, and deploying your database, your server. So it's just like if you're subscribing to the idea of using something like Auth0 for authorization. You don't want to build out your entire authorization scheme and worry about encryption and different things around security. You can depend on them to kind of have all of that worked out for you with user storage and things like that. And you can then not build it, just pay them to kind of manage that for you. It's kind of the same idea, but on the side of a database.
Is the model here that I write my own front end, like I write a mobile front end in React Native or in iOS and Android or on the web, and then I communicate directly with my GraphQL server, and that handles my entire backend?
That's the idea, yeah. With AppSync right now, we have a few different first-class databases that are just already out of the box configured to work really well without doing any extra work. So right now we have DynamoDB and Elasticsearch, and we also have Lambda functions. So if you're not using DynamoDB, if you're not using Elasticsearch, if you have maybe some other resources within AWS like Aurora or RDS, you can simply just use the Lambda function to interact with those. But we're working on possibly additional data stores that are first class that are going to be kind of part of what AppSync is. Also, if you already have an existing MongoDB somewhere out there database, you can just use a Lambda function to interact with it. So basically, the idea would be to use Lambda functions as the entry points into your other data sources, and then have the GraphQL as the single source of your API URL.
Now, first of all, a minor elephant that I want to get out of the room. So for people who are just hacking on apps, which as I know is a lot of a large percentage of the audience is like bootcamp grads and college students and stuff. The idea of using managed services to hack together what you're building, in terms of like the expense that you're going to spend on these things, is almost always going to be super trivial. Like you might as well be, it's like, $5 a month or $20 a month or something like that in exchange for saving you tons of time. So I just want to say up front, I'm a big fan of the idea of using managed services to save time and to build faster. Now that said, I think there's actually quite a big array of different managed services to choose from. So for example, I have not used AppSync. It sounds perfectly reasonable to me. I've used Firebase. Firebase has been an amazing tool for me. So I've used it in 2 or 3 different applications, and it's just been so simple. And I don't even write much software anymore. So the fact that I can work with Firebase quite easily makes me really optimistic. How do people choose? How do you recommend people choose between these different back-endless models of development, because I think Firebase is sort of the Google version of the back-endless development system, and AppSync is AWS's back-endless system.
Yeah, so it really depends on the type of application you're building and kind of like what you're comfortable with. So when you're working with some of the stuff that we're building, I can't really speak to anything else, but with AWS and especially with AppSync, you're really using the service because you know that you're going to be dealing with something that is scalable. You're going to be dealing with something that is secure. You're going to be dealing with something that has already been battle tested and that's kind of production ready. Like the trade-off and you talked about just when you're prototyping stuff, how much easier it is and how much time you save when you use these managed services. And that's entirely true. When you think about, if you kind of value your time at a certain rate, or if you charge, hourly for your time to build stuff, you can kind of think of it that way. So if you're like a $100 an hour developer and you want to, deploy a back end, is it going to cost you 10 or 15 hours to build this? That's going to be $1,000, $1,500, or do you want to spend, $5 or $10 or whatever it's going to cost to kind of just deploy it with one of these managed services? But another benefit of using AppSync, I guess you would say, we've really focused on a couple of things that are really starting to become more and more prevalent in more mobile applications, especially with the prevalence of IoT and where companies are trying to ship applications all around the world, where their connectivity might not work as well as what we're used to. And those two things that we're really focused on when we were building AppSync and that we're continuing to focus on are offline functionality that works out of the box and real-time functionality. So when you're using an application, when you go in the subway, so for instance, if you have Twitter, you go in the subway, you lose connectivity, you're liking tweets and stuff like that. You might not be able to like get a new feed, but you can still interact with the application without it crashing. You come back online, you don't really get an error or anything. You kind of expect the app to continue to work. Now, in reality, building that type of application is really hard. You have to think of a lot of different scenarios. You have to handle a lot of different use cases. With our AppSync GraphQL client and AppSync together, we have an offline functionality that's just built in out of the box. And it works not only with JavaScript applications, but we also have native clients. So if you're an iOS developer and Android developer, we have first-class GraphQL clients that work in this fashion. And then the second is subscriptions, which are the real-time functionality. And this isn't really an AppSync specific thing. It's more of a GraphQL thing. But with you mentioned Firebase, and they're really really well known not only for their managed services as a managed database, but also for its real-time capabilities. So if you've worked with Angular Fire, it's really a nice experience. With GraphQL, you have this idea of subscriptions, which is the real-time functionality that you get with GraphQL. And the idea is you have a data set that you've pulled down and your application is rendering it to the screen. You subscribe then to changes within that data set. So if anything changes there, for instance, you have an array of tweets, for example, when someone pushes a new tweet to that data source, your subscription fires and the new piece of data that you haven't already had comes down and gets pulled down into your application. And then you have that data in real time. And the same thing, I guess, with messaging applications or even dashboards, or if you're building something like a editing application where you have like multiple people editing like a document, for example. This is where that real time and also the offline stuff makes a huge difference.
Azure Container Service simplifies the deployment, management, and operations of Kubernetes. Eliminate the complicated planning and deployment of fully orchestrated, containerized applications with Kubernetes. You can quickly provision clusters to be up and running in no time, while simplifying your monitoring and cluster management through auto upgrades and a built-in operations console. Avoid being locked into any one vendor or resource. You can continue to work with the tools that you already know, such as Helm, and move applications to any Kubernetes deployment. Integrate with your choice of container registry, including Azure Container Registry. Also, quickly and efficiently scale to maximize your resource utilization without having to take your applications offline. isolate your application from infrastructure failures, and transparently scale the underlying infrastructure to meet growing demands, all while increasing the security, reliability, and availability of critical business workloads with Azure. To learn more about Azure Container Service and other Azure services, as well as receive a free ebook by Brendan Burns, go to aka.ms/sedaily. Brendan Burns is the creator of Kubernetes, and his ebook is about some of the distributed systems design lessons that he has learned building Kubernetes. That ebook is available at aka.ms/sedaily. As we're talking about this stuff, I know there are people in the audience who are fresh bootcamp grads, or they just graduated with a computer science degree, and they have been building applications in Java, or they've been building Node.js applications, or they've been learning Ruby on Rails in their boot camp. And now they're hearing, wait, we don't need those backends? Like, we're just supposed to actually completely change our paradigm and move into a world of completely managed services? That's how we should be hacking together our greenfield apps? So if you were to have a conversation with somebody like that, how would you tell them to shift their mindset to picking from this palette of managed services instead of the very tried and true, and in fact a model of application development that's going to take a lot of time for people to sort of overcome as the default, which is like, let's stand up a monolith and then let's start building a front end to talk to the monolith, and etc. Like with managed services, you really can throw a lot of that out the window, but I think people are having trouble letting go of that idea.
So I don't feel like it's like a winner takes all thing, to be completely honest. This is just my view of everything, but the way I see it is we're going to see more and more front-end developers be able to take on a lot of the work of back-end developers. And I feel like back-end developers are going to be, of course, still very much so in demand. I think they might move to, instead of just building like REST APIs where they're just throwing up endpoints, they might move on to more important tasks or more specialized tasks. You're seeing a lot more data science and stuff like that around the backend with backend developers, or people that understand like these languages really well, like Python and whatever, C++ and stuff like that. I don't really think it's going to be, all of a sudden, these skills are worthless. And instead, I think we're going to see these skill sets be just changed in a way where front-end developers can to take on a lot of this extra work that was being done. And then the backend developers are just going to be doing similar things, but maybe slightly different things. And you kind of see this in how we've seen cloud computing change over the last few years with the move to more and more people using these serverless services. But just serverless in general has taken off, but you still see a huge demand for DevOps and people that understand, how to be a network engineer and things like that, and system administrator.
Completely agree. I was kind of playing a bit of an extreme, taking extreme position there, but really it's
a good point there.
Well, so the thrust of what you're trying to say is, if you're somebody who's a mobile developer, or you consider yourself a web front-end developer, you can leverage these tools to get a lot more mileage out of your position and probably build apps a lot faster than you would have had to in the past. Especially if you would have in the past needed a back-end developer to help you with standing up some of those endpoints. Now you can focus a lot more on design. You can focus a lot more on user experience. You may not even need a back-end developer on your quote-unquote team.
This is entirely true. I mean, I just published an application to my GitHub repo called Herd, and it's HERD, like, I heard something. And it's kind of like me creating a clone of what Twitter would be. And when you think about Twitter, like, you see all these different Twitter apps that are in tutorials and stuff like that and documentation. But a lot of times they don't really take into account things like following and followers, and you want to listen for new tweets. So when a tweet comes in, you want it to kind of show up in your screen. And then you have to think about authorization and fine-grained access control. And then, of course, before that, you have to have authentication. So imagine building all of that from scratch, from the ground up as a new developer. It's just mind-bogglingly hard in a real-world, application. But I threw all this stuff together using AWS Amplify, which is something I would like to talk about too in just a second. But the idea is we have a bunch of different services that are geared towards this serverless or managed service model, where front-end developers, once they've gotten to the point where they're competent with their front-end tooling, they can then move on and learn how to work in the ecosystem or in the consoles of these managed services, and then just be the glue that kind of interacts with those managed services. But yeah, ideally, if you are in like a startup scenario and you're just strapped for resources, this is the way to go, in my opinion. And you're going to hit a wall you're going to probably get to a point where something isn't scaling well, or you need something that you just can't do. You're going to end up, of course, needing to bring on more and more people. But the fact that you can build something as a single developer that not only works, but scales, because when you think about it, we can all build something that works, but it might take a little extra time, but really in reality, some of the issues that happen or when you end up getting a bunch of users and you have to worry about that scalability. These managed services, especially are well suited for that. So if you can spend the same amount of time or less time building something that doesn't scale versus building something that does scale, I think it's like a no-brainer.
AWS Amplify, what is that?
So Amplify is a CLI that we just released on July 16th, and it's a JavaScript SDK that was released last year in 2017. So it's two different things now. Before, we only had the JavaScript SDK, but now with the CLI, it's kind of more of a workflow, I guess you'd say, for front-end developers to quickly scaffold cloud-enabled applications or manage serverless applications from their command line. So if you've thought about, if you're familiar with Rails, you kind of understand how it came out of nowhere a little bit and revolutionized really the way a lot of developers were able to become all of a sudden extremely efficient in building real-world web applications. Because from the command line, you could just spin up a lot of functionality just with a single command. You have the controllers and models, and you could do authorization and things like that. So Amplify, you install it as from your command line. It's a globally installed NPM package, and then you can scaffold different services. So you can just say you can just say Amplify init, which will create a new Amplify serverless application in your the current folder that you're in. And then you can add things like authorization. You can add things like a GraphQL API. You can add analytics. You can add chatbots. You can add AR and VR stuff. You can add all types of stuff just with these single commands. And you can just add one thing at a time. And then say that you're just playing around with something and you don't like it anymore, you can just remove it. It's pretty easy. I think it's a really good entry point into working with these more sophisticated services for front-end developers, because we're so used to working on the command line, and it's kind of like something we're used to. So it's like, your views create React app, you're working with NPM and stuff. Now you can just spin up a cloud-enabled cloud-enabled application and start adding services from the command line. So the command line is the Amplify CLI, and then the JavaScript SDK is the Amplify library. And it's a library to kind of be the glue between the services in your front-end application. We, again, do all types of stuff there. We do authorization and analytics and push notifications and a host of other things. I think we have like 11 or 12 different things. And then we even have special components for Angular and for React and React Native, or we just have a vanilla JavaScript implementation.
AR example I find really interesting, because if you let's say you wanted to build some combination augmented reality and streaming application, something like, I don't know, I'm having trouble thinking of an application, but I'm sure we'll see things like this where there is a high bandwidth video stream that is being run between your device and the cloud, and there's all kinds of buffering and latency issues and codecs and all these complicated things that you don't want to think about as a developer. And these are solved problems. They've been solved by companies like AWS, and so or like Mux. That's a sponsor of the show, but also friends of the show. They work on video streaming APIs, but I know these are hard problems from talking to these people. But your idea with the AWS Amplify stuff is basically, if you wanted to include that in your app, it kind of makes sense for this to be provided by a managed service, in contrast to something like an NPM package, because an NPM package is not going to be able to manage, or it's not auto-configured to manage cloud infrastructure for you. But here you're talking about something where it's a CLI it's from AWS, so it's probably comes already connected to your cloud account. And if you just wanted to declaratively say, I want AR streaming capabilities in my app, it makes sense to do that through a cloud provider CLI. Am I kind of understanding the gist of Amplify correctly?
Exactly right on the head, actually, because what ends up happening when you do initialize a new project, you have like a copy of the config locally, and then you also have the actual application service that's been spun up in your account. And then you can go into the account and actually look, in the console if you'd like to I don't know, play around with the settings or whatever from there. And then say that you make a change in your settings there, you can just pull down the new configuration in your application. Or if you make a change locally, you can just push up the new configuration. So as you make changes, you're kind of working from this flow of local to your actual managed service, and you're able to interact with it from the command line, which is really powerful.
I think this stuff is so exciting. The proliferation of managed services, not to be a shill for the cloud industry or for the for the type of companies that support software engineering daily, but like as a developer with as much objectivity as I can speak with, this stuff is super exciting because so we've been talking about, we started the conversation talking about kind of CRUD apps, like a photo sharing app or a social network like Twitter or a dating website. And those are interesting, right? Like CRUD apps are never going to become uninteresting. But we're kind of, we're at the frontier of some really exciting technologies, things like machine learning, like augmented reality, like video streaming, that building them with open source software it sounds great. I mean, it is great, but there's a lot of challenges in the network and things that it makes sense to have to pay for. It makes sense to have a cloud provider help you with these things. And so I kind of want to get into a conversation around managed services and how to leverage them, because I think this is an underexplored area. So like people who are trying to think of entrepreneurial ideas, and I know there's a lot of listeners who are like that, I think, there's a brainstorming process to be built around looking at managed services. Like it's sort of like an artist. An artist sits down in front of their palette, or a pianist sits down in front of their piano and is like, okay, what can I make out of these colors, or what can I make out of these piano keys? With a developer now, you can look at all these managed services. Like you could look at Algorithmia, you could look at AppSync, you could look at Google's Video Intelligence API. You could look at ARKit. ARKit's not a managed service, but something like that. So Amazon has a zillion of these different services. Do you have any ideas around the ideation process, the brainstorming process of a developer who is in this sort of new world where there's this proliferation of managed services that are extremely high leverage and have just not been explored very much?
Yes. I mean, I have a lot of opinions about this. It's one of the reasons I actually joined the team, because before working with AWS, I was running a really, really successful consulting company. And I did not have a lack of business. That's not why I switched gears a little bit. It was because I saw some of the stuff they're working on. And I really am always interested in like the next big thing. And if you think about cloud resources in general, or working in a cloud environment in general, it basically allows, people to trade capital expense for variable expense. So instead of having to, when you come back to the general idea of cloud services, instead of having to build and manage your infrastructure, buy these servers and all of this extra, resources that you may need just in case, you're instead able to scale and then just pay for them as you go, as your actual application grows. So if you move, or if you take that general philosophy and apply that maybe to actual software engineering, this is kind of where I see what this stuff is all about. So what that to me means, say I'm a front-end developer, or just say I'm an app developer and I want to build something and I don't know how to build this server. Say I go get an estimate and the person that says it's going to cost to get this service and this service and this service built, it's going to be, say, $100,000. What if instead I could just subscribe to a managed version of that service for a few pennies a day? And then once I get enough users to where I actually am successful, okay, I have money coming in now. My build then does actually go up some, but I can actually afford to pay it then. So you're able to innovate a little bit easier as well, because you're able to kind of build these sophisticated things without having to invest a lot of money up front. But as like a new developer coming into the ecosystem, or even an existing developer, you kind of have to think of efficiency. And I think this is the ultimate form of efficiency, because you're able to take on a lot more work, but not really work, I would say. You're able to accomplish a lot more work than the typical developer if you kind of understand how to utilize these things and be efficient with them. So instead of a company, so in a few years, say, for example, a company or someone wants to hire someone to build something, if you're able to come to the table and deliver 5x, and we always hear things like the 10x developer. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying if you're able to deliver 5x more capabilities and functionality than your competition, they're going to hire you. And I believe in the future, we're going to see developers getting paid a lot more that can understand this entire idea and kind of navigate their way through these different providers that offer these different services, not just AWS, but just in general.
I completely agree. I think it's super exciting for me. Okay, so things like push notifications, SMS stuff, building chat applications, CRUD apps, scaling a database, scaling serverless functions. I think of these as kind of like solved problems, not fully solved, but there's a lot of really good solutions for these things. So if you're struggling to build like a CRUD app, or struggling to figure out how to deploy a database, there's a lot of solutions for these things. And we talked about that at the beginning with AppSync. I think of that as kind of a frontier solution to solving your CRUD, solving your API management issue. Not to say these are easy problems to solve. There's best practices, there's well-defined tooling around it, and the tooling will always get better. But I wanted to ask you about the things that are still a little bit too difficult, or the things that have recently gotten easy. So I think of something that recently got easier, perhaps augmented reality, perhaps image recognition, or audio transcription. These are things that have recently gotten extremely easy because they've been turned into APIs. There are things that are still a little bit difficult. I think machine learning is one example there, where, yes, there are frameworks for it. There are cloud services for it, like SageMaker from Amazon. I've heard really good things about that. But Algorithmia has something around machine learning deployments. Aside from machine learning, what are the things that are still a little bit too difficult, or the things that have recently gotten easy that are exciting to you? The frontier.
So for sure, we're seeing, when I say I'm seeing a lot of demand for machine learning engineers. We're seeing that it's not easy to build real world machine learning algorithms that actually work with data sets, because there's just a lot to learn there. And there's also such a high demand that, any competent engineer that understands machine learning or data science to a degree can make a lot of money, especially compared to just a typical developer. So to me, I see that machine learning I'm seeing like glimpses of what could be a solved version of machine learning. And that's in managed services again, where you can have a API that you can interact with to do certain things. But in reality, say that you have a specialized problem that needs to be solved, you have to actually hire someone that understands how to write this code and also how to work with the proper data sets and do everything. And I think I feel like that's not going to be a solved problem. I think we're going to see more and more frameworks and libraries that are built to make it easier. I don't think that entire idea can be ever abstracted away. What we are seeing that's become super like duper easy are things like authorization. Like it's almost like crazy now, in my opinion, as a small company to small company, I guess you'd say, like especially to build your own authentication layer when you really are worried about security, when you can just work with one of these managed services. That's just my opinion, of course. But yeah, that's really easy now. Working with GraphQL, over the last few years has gotten much easier. And now with AppSync, I feel like I'm not going to say it's a solved problem, but you don't have to build your own GraphQL API anymore. You can just spin one up and just hit an endpoint and it works. That's pretty cool. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's probably dozens of examples out there, but those are just the two that are off the top of my mind, because I've felt the pain of actually building these things. And now that I can just I guess the first time I ever used Auth0, that was when I was really like, wow, this is an amazing service. After building all this stuff myself and then using that, that was my first glimpse into these types of services. And now I work with Cognito, which to me is just awesome as well. I'm really sold on that stuff. So.
Cloud computing can get expensive. If you're spending too much money on your cloud infrastructure, check out Dabit International. Dabit International helps startups optimize the costs of their workloads across Google Cloud and AWS so that the startups can spend more time building their new software and less time reducing their cost. Dabit International helps clients optimize their costs. And if your cloud bill is over $10,000 per month, you can get a free cost optimization assessment by going to doit-intl.com/sedaily. That's doit-intl.com/sedaily. This assessment will show you how you can save money on your cloud. And Dabit International is offering it to our listeners for free. They normally charge $5,000 for this assessment, but Dabit International is offering it free to listeners of the show with more than $10,000 in monthly spend. And if you don't know whether or not you're spending $10,000, if your company is that big, there's a good chance you're spending $10,000. So maybe go ask somebody else in the finance department. Dabit International is a company that's made up of experts in cloud engineering and optimization. They can help you run your infrastructure more efficiently by helping you use commitments, spot instances, right sizing, and unique purchasing techniques. This to me sounds extremely domain specific. So it makes sense to me from that perspective to hire a team of people who can help you figure out how to implement these techniques. Dabit International can help you write more efficient code. They can help you build more efficient infrastructure. They also have their own custom software that they've written, which is a complete cost optimization platform for Google Cloud. And that's available at reoptimize.io as a free service if you want to check out what Dabit International is capable of building. Dabit International are experts in cloud cost optimization, and if you're spending more than $10,000, you can get a free assessment by going to doit-intl.com/sedaily and see how much money you can save on your cloud deployment. We got to talk some about the front end, because if we're talking about the whole picture of how application development is changing, we have to touch on the front end, and you're an expert in this area. You were running your own business with React Native training, and as you said, you did not have any shortage of business. You moved on to Amazon because it sounds like you were curious about the rest of the stack. I mean, you're going to come out of this Amazon experience, or maybe you'll stay there for decades, who knows. But in any case, I'm sure you're going to be brimming with ideas very shortly because you know how fast people can build really impressive front-end applications at this point, and now you're going to get a masterclass in what's available to rapidly develop at the back end. But since we've talked about the back end at this point, we've talked about these APIs, we've talked about building your back-endless back end, I got to ask you about the front end. So there's a couple of interesting developments. So first of all, you were working on React Native training, and that was, I believe, was you were helping businesses figure out their internal strategies, their internal processes around developing React Native applications, which is a cross-platform framework for developing mobile applications. So you write what is it? Write once, write anywhere, or something.
Yeah, it's like learn once, write anywhere.
Learn once, write anywhere. Right. So basically, the idea is you get to write mobile applications faster. So a couple interesting data points. So recently, we've done a couple shows about Flutter, which is Google's spin on the cross-platform mobile application development. And there was also this Airbnb post about how Airbnb had built a ton of code around React Native, and then they announced, this is not working out for us. We're moving off of React Native slowly but steadily. So I want to throw those two ideas at you, and I want to get your perspective, especially because now you don't really have a dog in the fight. Where is cross-platform mobile development today, and what are your thoughts on how it looks in the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, so like me personally, I'm all about some efficiency. Like I am like when I see something that can increase efficiency, I'm all over it. And I feel like that was the reason that I got into React Native development in the first place. Not only was it really cool to build a mobile app with with JavaScript and then be able to go then build a website with JavaScript, but now we're able to build like VR and AR and desktop apps and Apple Watch apps and whatever. You can build like a dozen different targets with React Native. And I think that's where React really shines and React Native really shines. And I still am actually super bullish on React Native, but definitely Flutter has been a newcomer in the mix. Actually, I gave a talk about the future of cross-platform application development about exactly a year ago. And it was at React Native EU. And part of my talk was about Flutter. And I feel like a lot of the predictions that and a lot of the thoughts that I had behind Flutter, I've seen actually continue and maybe even become more of a reality faster than I expected. So to me, like right now, of course, in that space, there are two main, of course, competitors. And in my opinion, that's React Native and Flutter. And I think that with, I'll talk about React Native first. React Native has been around now for over 3 years, I think. It was around 2015, March, I believe it was released. So it's been around for over 3 years. And that's a short amount of time, but it's also a long amount of time compared to Flutter. What we've seen is a lot of companies have adopted React Native at an early stage. I think that was Airbnb's situation. And they've had time to actually, work with it and it found out that it's not right for them. And if you actually read through the blog post, they had a lot of good points there. And if you've kept up with the React Native ecosystem and the repo lately, you've noticed that there hasn't been a lot of activity within the Facebook actual organization into the project. And they released a blog post recently kind of talking about why that was. And that's because they're actually addressing a lot of the issues.
You said Facebook released a blog post recently talking about that?
Yes. Facebook released, it's on the Facebook blog. I can give you a link to it. Maybe we can share it with the people listening.
Sure.
Yeah, and they went over like 3 main points in the blog post. They're re-engineering how React Native is built, actually, how it works. And they've spent some time over the last months actually doing that. And a lot of the issues that Airbnb had were addressed in that blog post. And I think that once React Native releases this new version, we're going to see a lot of the pain points addressed there. But I will say this about React Native versus Flutter. I think in the couple of years, we're going to see an equal fight between the two. I wouldn't say fight, but we're going to see, I think both of them are going to be equally viable because I think that Flutter has a lot of advantages that React Native doesn't have. And those have a lot to do with how the project is actually run. I love Facebook's team and React Native. I know a lot of those guys personally. They're like amazing. But I feel like Google has taken in Flutter and put it as like a first-class citizen, and they're listening to everything that people are saying, and they're very responsive. They have pristine documentation and examples. And they have a few things built in that React Native doesn't really support, that they kind of let the community support, like navigation, UI libraries and stuff like that, that Flutter actually maintains. And I feel like that's a huge plus. So like for me, if I was going to pick up cross-platform development today, I would actually look at both and see what I liked better. If you want to build web applications and you want to build VR and AR, you might want to look at React Native. But if you're strictly worried about deploying to iOS and Android, I might choose Flutter at this point. That's just because I really like the way that the project's handled, and I feel like the people running it are not only as competent as the Facebook people, but they're more engaged and actually being, I don't know, they're being more proactive about stuff.
Well, so I interviewed Eric, who is the engineering manager on Flutter, and I mean, he was talking about, so first of all, like Flutter directly interfaces with the GP, I guess was it the GPU? But anyway, it interfaces with the operating system in the same way that OpenGL does. So it's like, it's like you're almost like you're building a game. Like games are cross-platform applications that work really well on both iOS and Android, and that's because games are often written, I guess, in OpenGL or in Unity or something, like these game engines that compile in a way that is very close to the hardware. And so it runs on both iOS and Android, and it runs performantly, but the thing is it doesn't maintain the UI elements. And so that you know, they talked about re-engineering these UI developments in the context of this game engine like runtime API. And I'm sure Eric can explain it better than I can, but he talked about, I believe they would record the speed at which native UI components would perform. They would literally use a high definition camera to record the physics, and then they would use the math from those recordings to recreate those in the context of Flutter. And anyway, I'm not gonna butcher this story anymore, but really the precision and the approach, the highly disciplined approach to Flutter, that really impressed me.
Holy moly, that's interesting. That's super interesting. I'm gonna have to actually listen to that episode.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of the future stuff, like, have you seen the Fuchsia stuff, or the I guess it's a rumor mill, but the Fuchsia operating system coming out of Google?
I have. I don't know a lot about it.
Nobody
I've read
does.
A few different threads on it. So, yeah.
Nobody does, but it's interesting to think about, like, oh, you know, here we got a new operating system, and here's a UI layer that runs anywhere, and it would be pretty cool to have like a completely fresh start, completely new UIs, completely new operating system. And anyway, I'm getting us off topic. Anyway, coming back to application development today. So we've got nice cross-platform tools. Whether you're talking about Flutter or React Native, I mean, we can pick Democrat or Republican. In any case, the world is improving. You know, things are getting quite easy on the front end. Things are getting quite plentiful on the back end. What does this change about entrepreneurship, about product development?
Well, just like how the cloud in general just enabled more innovation, more experimentation, and just more activity, I think we're going to see just more and more of that. We're going to see an acceleration of that. Because again, if you as a single developer can take your skill set and extend it to do all these other things, like why not? And once you have all these people that have taken their existing skill set and added all of these new things that they can do, they're going to be building more and more stuff. And I think it's going to, you're going to see a lot of positive things happen as far as new ideas being fleshed out, where people could before have an idea and not actually be able to do anything with it. They may be able to actually get a prototype out now, and then maybe people will see it and they'll get funding. It's just more experimentation, more innovation, and more opportunity to try things out that may or may not work because you have the ability now. And I think if you're listening and you're a front-end developer and you think of yourself of a front-end developer and you're like, oh, should I learn? Like, what should I learn next? I mean, seriously consider the idea of what maybe could be called a serverless developer or serverless plus developer. I don't really have a name for it, but a developer that can competently work with all of these managed services to extend your capabilities to do all these other things. And I think Amplify is a good place to start, but I wouldn't limit it to that. Like, look around, see what's out there, and just think about this paradigm, because and really notice as things progress in the future, when you see these startups that are coming out with these microservices, we're going to see a lot. I think we're going to see a lot more of companies that are building services that will work in this same way that we're talking about.
So you were running your own business with React Native training before this, and now you're at Amazon. Existentially, how do the two compare? So I briefly worked at Amazon. That is a seriously entrepreneurial organization, and in some sense you get to be more entrepreneurial than at Amazon than you would running your own thing, because you have access to these crazy resources. So how does your lifestyle as an entrepreneur compare between running React Native and now working at Amazon?
So this is my first time working at a large corporation company like this. So it's been definitely a major change than just completely working on your own. But my role there is actually a developer advocate. A developer advocate does a few things. First of all, we write blog posts explaining how to use a lot of the different tools that we have. We speak at conferences talking about some of the new tooling that we have coming out and new services and stuff like that. I appear on podcasts, of course, like the one we're listening to. But really the main bread and butter of my position is actually interacting with developers and talking to them and kind of understanding the different issues that they're having and what they like or what they don't like about just anything, and bringing that information back to the engineers and the project and product managers, and kind of fleshing out ways to improve things really in the developer ecosystem. And I work with AWS Mobile, which is the mobile team. So we focus somewhat, but not 100% on mobile. We're also focused on IoT and serverless stuff. But I would say changing from my day to day, I actually not a whole lot, believe it or not. I used to travel 3 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks out of the month. I work remotely now, so I do still travel, but not as much. So I travel maybe 2 weeks out of the month, and there aren't a lot of remote employees with AWS. But as a developer advocate, I'm actually on the road a lot anyway, so it doesn't matter as much. And I'm doing a lot of videos and recordings and stuff. So it's good for me to kind of have my own space. I think that's why it worked out for me. I am as an individual, just a really hardworking person, or I work a lot of hours, I guess you'd say. I would say it hasn't been a lot of change. I don't feel like I have a lot of oversight as far as you have to do this at my current position. It's more as long as we're out there bringing back good information from our customers and trying to improve the customer experience. And as long as, I'm doing stuff, they're cool with it. So it seems to be a somewhat more laid back than I was expecting culture, because I haven't heard a lot of that from Amazon. I always hear that it might be, a lot of work and stuff like that. And it is a lot of work, but I feel like it's not, it's a much better experience than I expected.
Well, that's so true. So I used to work at Amazon very briefly, just 8 months. And some people have gotten the perception from me saying that I didn't like working at Amazon. And that, I just want to put it out there, that was not at all the case. I loved Amazon, and the organization really shaped how I think about the world and how I think about entrepreneurship. I think if you're an entrepreneur, it's possible that if you don't know what you're doing and you don't have a reputation or anything, you can't start your own business, it's quite possible that there's literally no better place to go, because it's basic training for entrepreneurship. And the reality is that the real world is kind of difficult. It's not straightforward how to build your own business. It takes a lot of work, but once you kind of figure it out, you're oh, okay, you kind of work hard and you rinse and repeat, and you've got to work long hours, and that's just the nature of reality. So it doesn't surprise me that coming from the real world, where you built your own business and you realized how much you had to do on your own, and then you went to Amazon, you're oh, this actually is not at all like that New York Times article that I read. Anyway, not to put words in your mouth, but I really like Amazon, and I didn't feel like I was strained as an individual. I know that there's a public perception that it does strain you.
Yes, totally. I'm curious, like, what team were you working with there?
I was on a team, I think it was Amazon Global. And so I worked on like logistics software.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I mean, like you mentioned, people don't realize how much of an entrepreneurial spirit there is within the company. I mean, this is at AWS, of course. I haven't worked in the Amazon, like the rest of Amazon, so I can't really speak to that. But we have a lot of free reign to kind of innovate and do new things. And as long as the idea is like somewhat of a good idea, like we have full reign to pursue new things. And that's how a lot of services in AWS and a lot of ideas in Amazon have actually come about. People just thinking of something interesting and be like, hey, like, let's try this out. I mean, you'd be surprised. These aren't like ideas that come out of some like thought leader at the top of the company. A lot of times these are just engineers that'll throw together a white paper with an idea and it'll be pursued. And now you see millions of people using it. And I think working in AWS and seeing how all the different services are connected is really beneficial. Like you said, if you're looking to be in the future like an entrepreneur, seeing how things kind of work together and how to work with these cloud services, it's definitely a good place to be. I'm really enjoying it.
Yeah. And that culture, man, that culture is something else.
Yeah, it fits me perfectly. So I like it a lot.
Okay, well, Nader, this has been great. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Jeff, for having me back on. I really enjoyed it. I hope that a lot of people got a lot out of this. And if anyone ever wants to talk about this stuff, I'm readily available on Twitter. My Twitter handle is Dabit3, Dabit, and the number 3. GitHub and Medium are the same handle if you ever want to read any of my stuff or check out my code.
GoCD is a continuous delivery tool created by ThoughtWorks. It's open source and free to use, and GoCD has all the features you need for continuous delivery. Model your deployment pipelines without installing any plugins. Use the value stream map to visualize your end-to-end workflow. And if you use Kubernetes, GoCD is a natural fit to add continuous delivery to your project. With GoCD running on Kubernetes, you define your build workflow and let GoCD provision and scale your infrastructure on the fly. GoCD agents use Kubernetes to scale as needed. Check out gocd.org/sedaily and learn about how you can get started. GoCD was built with the learnings of the ThoughtWorks engineering team, who have talked about building the product in previous episodes of Software Engineering Daily, and it's great to see the continued progress on GoCD with the new Kubernetes integrations. You can check it out for yourself at gocd.org/sedaily, and thank you so much to ThoughtWorks for being a longtime sponsor of Software Engineering Daily. We're proud to have ThoughtWorks and GoCD as sponsors of the show.
Wow!